So I think with Islam, it's really important to be prepared. To prepare yourself for conversation with your Muslim neighbour or for political issues or whatever domain you're in. Are you an employer that you employ Muslims? Are you a teacher? How do you respond? You know, to get the categories going in your mind so that you can see what solutions might look like. I had a friend who told me about an encounter between a Muslim teenager at Sydney University and a graduate of Moore College, the Anglican Theological College. And they're having this debate and conversation, and the person who had the degree in theology found himself to be completely unprepared for the arguments and the questions that were being thrown at him by the young Muslim boy. However, the young Muslim was just relating out of standard Islamic training. That is, every Muslim is trained to have a view on Christianity. Every Muslim believes certain things about what Christians believe. Every Muslim has some sort of apologetic that's been imparted to them to deliver to Christians. And so you get this very unequal conversation happening where a Muslim has been trained to ask really difficult questions for Christians, and the Christian knows nothing about Islam. He spent his theological studies learning about Reformation issues and problems with the Catholic Church, or whatever it was that he was studying in theological college, sacraments and the church, theology of the church, all good topics, but nothing to prepare him for Islam. And that's a problem for us. So I really encourage Christians to talk with Muslims, make friends with them, invite them to your house, talk to them about their faith, reach out to them. That's really important, but don't do it out of ignorance. Understand some basic things. Don't go into it like a babe in the woods, you know, and don't be like that theological graduate with a young boy running rings around him because he had no equipping. I have a friend, Samuel Green, who's based in Tasmania. He works for AFES, and he's a fantastic trainer. And if you want a resource to train you in understanding Islam, he has a website. I think it's called Engaging with Islam, and he has a video course on that. He's written a great book. He's just a fantastic trainer, very accurate information. Samuel Green, Engaging with Islam. Now, Christians need to understand Islam. And not just our superficial, this is my Christian impression, but understand it from the inside, how it looks to Muslims. No, not just knowing that there's 5 pillars or 6 core beliefs. There needs to be a deeper grasp of the Islamic worldview of Sharia and the way it forms people, the way it influences people. We also need to develop resilience so that we're not intimidated by things that are intended to pressure us, to silence us, to force us to step aside. We need to examine and reconsider all our worldview assumptions about the way religions work and about human beings as well. There's a view since the Enlightenment that religion is just personal, private, and essentially irrational. And many Christians, sadly, have bought into that view. Their religion is just their personal affair. But in secularized nations, Islam has been accepted into this religion category, assuming that Islam is just this kind of private, personal thing. But it's not. It's a political ideology. It's been accepted under the multicultural umbrella, but it's more than just a culture. It's an ideology of dominance and rule. Islam is theologically hardwired to seek out power, political power, military power, and there needs to be a reckoning with this inconsistency between the way our society views religion as something intensely personal and private and the reality of how Islam functions. And we need to work out as a nation how to deal with these issues. Years ago, I wrote a blog post on a dozen bad ideas for understanding Islam. I think I called it a dozen bad ideas for the 21st century. So over the years, I've spoken to many, many groups, and I get lots and lots of questions. And as I heard all the questions, I began to recognize that some were being asked again and again. And I was able to identify these dozen beliefs that are quite common in our culture, and you might be influenced by some of these as well, but they really make it difficult for you to understand Islam. And they're all not true, really. So one is the belief that all religions are the same. So many people believe that. Another is the belief that religion's irrelevant as a cause for anything. You know, people go to war over land, over resources, over whatever they go to war for, but not religion. Religion's not the real cause. In fact, people write books about this saying, you know, religion is not the cause of war. On the other hand, there are some in the West that say religion's the cause of all wars, but this whole question of the relationship between faith and conflict is very messy in our minds. But basically there's this view that religion, because it's personal and private, it's sort of irrelevant in the public sphere. And I think that's the dominant view in our nation. You shouldn't bring religion into politics, for example. It's just your personal private views. The belief that we all worship the same God is another fallacy. The God of the Quran is very different from the God of the Bible. You need to understand the difference. The belief, this is an interesting one, people will say, well, the problem is that Islam hasn't had a reformation. And I have to explain that the Christian Reformation was not a progressive movement. It was a movement that said we should go back to the sources, to the Bible. And Islam has gone through that process. And Walid Ali, who's a Muslim media figure in Australia, he said, well, if you really understand Islam, you'll know that Islam's had a reformation, and Al-Qaeda is the result. People have gone back to the original source, which is the Quran and the life of Muhammad and the Sunnah, and the radical groups have come out of that. That's what the reformed Islam looks like, because the Christian Reformation was not just an embracing of humanistic progressive ideas, it was a rediscovery of Jesus and of the teachings of the epistles. And Islam has gone through that. So we're not waiting for an Islamic Reformation. Lord, protect us from an Islamic Reformation. The idea of Reformation in the Middle Ages was you go back to the source. That's what it meant. It didn't mean kind of advancing into some brave new future. The belief that dispelling ignorance will increase positive regard. I call this the To Kill a Mockingbird fallacy. At the end of the book, To Kill a Mockingbird, which has been read by hundreds of millions of young people across the English-speaking world, in school, it says, one of the characters says, you know, if you really know someone, you find out they're not so bad as you thought. So this is the idea that if you really knew people, you'd like them more. And if you don't like people, it's probably ignorance that's the problem. So how are you going to deal with that? Well, you get your education system to take ignorance out of people, and then they'll all love each other, and everything will be fine. But you know, sometimes dispelling ignorance should make you more troubled. Dispelling ignorance about Islam should make you think deeply about what that might mean. You can't just assume that if only you know people better, you'll love them more. You know, if someone's on a real evil path, for example, not necessarily Islam or anything, but if someone's really intent on doing harm, the more you know that person, the more you should be aware of how bad that is. It's not just that you'll like people if you knew them better. But that view has embedded itself in our kind of public psyche so deeply. It's sad in a way, because To Kill a Mockingbird is such a beautiful book, but at the heart of it is a deception. The belief that everyone is good and decent. I have a friend who's a good and decent man. He's not a believer, but he believes basically that people are decent. There's some bad apples, but basically people are okay. And if you just make a sincere effort to know other people, you'll come to think better of them, and we'll all be happy together. It's a very deeply held view in our culture. Belief in progress. Things will always get better in the end. The problem with Islam is they haven't had enough progress, and things will everything will be fine in the future. This is the idea that we want to be thought well of those that follow us, that we'll be on the right side of history, because obviously the people that come after us will be wiser and better than we are. The belief that you put something in context, it'll make it better. Oh, you're just taking that out of context. No, the context is not good. When you put things in context, it gets worse sometimes, not better. It's not just the case that putting something in context makes something better. It can be quite the opposite. Often with Islam, people say, oh, these radicals, they're taking the verses out of context. No, they're not. They're putting them in context. That's the problem. The belief that extremism is the problem and moderation is the solution. You know, this is the idea that the world is okay as long as we're in the middle of it. But if you get to the edge, you might go over the edge and you'd be an extremist. So it's not that ideas are bad or good, it's how you hold them that matters. Someone wrote a book in the 50s which said that, You know, when you look at these extreme radical movements, it's often the same people. They'll go from being a radical fascist to a radical communist, and these are the extremists, you know. But we should just be moderate and avoid all extremism, and everything will be fine. Now, you don't apply that to when you need a cardiologist to give you a heart transplant. You don't think, I just want a moderate doctor. I don't want someone who's too extreme about, you know, about hygiene or preventing infection. No extremists on me. I just want a moderate doctor, please. Look, if an idea is a good idea, you should hold it firmly without apology. And don't think that you can solve all these issues by just having some idea of moderation. Extremism is a lie. The idea that extremism explains things is a great deception. The belief that the West is always guilty, I'm sure we've seen examples of that. The idea of two wrongs make a right. So I say something troubling about Islam and you say, oh yeah, but what did the Christians do in the Crusades? Come again? How does what the Christians did in the Crusades have any relevance at all on whether a husband in Islam should beat his wife? You know, what's the relationship of that? But we often fall into that. Oh, you can't speak about that because you're white, or you're Jewish, or you're an Israeli, or you're whatever. You're a Christian, so you're invalid. So this is very deeply embedded in the way people respond to troubling issues. It's illogical. This is also, the two wrongs make a right is sort of related to the U2 reasoning, challenging someone by making a personal objection to someone. Belief in progress. Everything will always get better in the end. So these are bad ideas that have been woven into our secular contemporary culture, taught to our children, and they make it very hard for us to understand Islam. A roadmap. Well, the Islamic Sharia presents an enduring long-term challenge to nations. The challenge will not go away, but it can be managed better or worse. For example, giving millions of dollars to Islamic organisations, ostensibly, supposedly to counter radicalisation, has been bad. So has the acceptance of authorities in Australia of polygamous marriage. Denying theological roots of radicalism is another costly error. A vast fortune has been spent on de-radicalisation efforts around the world, almost all of which reject the idea that Islamic theology is the driver of radicalisation. It's just folly. We need to understand that Muslims who call for violent acts now are relying on compelling scriptural support from the Islamic canon. They're not necessarily disconnected from Islam. The radicals actually hold most of the high cards, the court cards as you call them, the aces, kings, queens and jacks in the card game for the soul of the Ummah. The moderates have 2s and 3s in their hands, and Al-Qaeda has the aces and the kings and the queens. That is, they have the actual quotes of Muhammad, the things he taught, the things the Quran says. Whereas the moderate, so-called moderate, only has kind of Western humanitarian assumptions or things their conscience tell them, which don't really count in the Islamic world. And that means that every generation of Muslims is at risk of being re-radicalised by someone who says, oh, this is what the texts say. The great Dutch scholar of Islam, Snooker Groningen, expected that Muslims would come to embrace modernity. By relegating jihad to the end of the world, Islam, he thought, would be contained to a purely personal religious faith, as Christianity had been in his experience. He advised colonial governments with Muslim populations such as Indonesia, the Dutch East Indies, to allow freedom of religion, but to suppress political Islam. In Aceh, where the Dutch fought a jihad insurgency for half a century, Snooker Groningen instructed the authorities to target religious leaders and try and encourage the non-religious leaders. Now, we have a number of possible responses that I would commend to you. One is inform ourselves and others, develop expertise to understand Islam and Muslims. Hold passionately to both love and truth. Don't sacrifice one for the other. In our culture, we're at risk of sacrificing truth for love. And many Christians are like that. Like, don't talk to me about things that are unpleasant. You just talk to me about loving Muslims. I was in England 20 years ago, and we were thinking of taking a team to go and do some teaching there. We'd travelled extensively in Australia and elsewhere. And I met English Christians, and they said to me, what you're saying about Islam is not false, but you can't tell people that. Oh, why is that? They said, because if you tell Christians those sorts of things, they won't love Muslims. Oh, I said, oh, that's interesting. And then they said, and if you tell them that and they attack us, if you tell Christians that and the Muslims attack us for those teachings, it'll be our fault. I thought, well, this is pretty far gone, you know. We're not allowed to tell the truth because that will compromise our love. And it'll be our fault if something bad happens, not the fault of the person with the knife in his hand. So we need both truth and love. You know, I have devoted years of my life to leading Muslims to Christ and building healthy Christian fellowship. I love Muslim people and I want to share the gospel with them. And actually, the more you understand how Islam works, the more compassionate you should feel for Muslims. And the more you should be motivated to help them find the Lord. It shouldn't be allowed to work the other way, that if you speak the truth about Islam, you're somehow disliking Muslims. I had this interesting conversation with a Palestinian theologian, and I was just talking about the Dhimma and the history of Christian-Muslim relations. He looked up the commentaries. He said, I can see that you've accurately described what the commentaries say. But he says, I couldn't believe what you believe or say what you believe about Islam and love Muslims. So he's basically implying, I will reject that truth, which I know to be true, because if I did that, I wouldn't have love. But for me, it's the opposite. You know, if you know, for example, that a battered woman is defending her husband because she's terrified, should that make you love her more because she's not speaking the truth? Sorry, should that make you love her less because she's not speaking the truth? You shouldn't. You should be able to speak the truth and say, look, the violence is the cause for that woman's plight, and be able to do that. That doesn't mean you're not caring for her or understanding her. So hold passionately to both love and truth. Grace and truth. Jesus is full of grace and truth, and grace is, the expression of grace is love. Teach people about the Christian foundations of our nation. We need to understand ourselves better and our Christian tradition better, and we often haven't done that. Preachers need to present fundamental truths that come out of the Bible about the human condition that underpin the nature of our culture and our nation. We need to deepen our understanding of the way religion, politics, and faith works. We need a revolution in theological education to equip churches better. We need to defend freedom of speech. We need to share the gospel in love and truth with Muslims. We need to support and guide our politicians, our journalists, and other leaders. Make an appointment to go and see your local member. Talk to him about your concerns, or her about your concerns. We need to recognise and call out falsehoods. I've tried to show you what I've tried to do in this area. It doesn't mean you're denigrating people or attacking them individually, but there's a way of saying, look, this is the actual evidence that we have. This is the truth. Don't be afraid. Be courageous. Look beyond the urgent to what is important and enduring. These issues are issues for the next century or more. You know, should the Lord tarry. These are not issues that are just an issue for this year. These are issues for the next decades to come, for your children's children's children. That has been the history with Islam. It's a very long history of conflict and challenge. So think long term. Don't just think, what can I do now? Think, what should we be doing for the years to come? Here are some resources. I mentioned Samuel Green. He's written a book called Where to Start with Islam, which is great. He has online training. Danny Bourmawi's book, Islam, Israel and the West, is really great. He's a Muslim background believer. The converts from Islam are beginning to become more important and dominant in the voice of people who are challenging Islam. There's my book, The Third Choice, The Which God as Well. There's articles on my website. There's teaching videos on my channel. If you want to read the hadiths, it's a bit of an afternoon's entertainment. You can look up sunnah.com, which has thousands and thousands of them. The slides, remember, from this seminar are available at markjury.com/U. There are books that you could read about understanding the Christianity in the West and our culture. So Dominion by Tom Holland, he goes through 2,000 years of history and traces the influence of biblical thought. The Golden Thread, A History of the Western Tradition, another one. The Builder's Stone by Melanie Phillips. The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self by Carl Trueman describes the ideology of the self-realizing individual and how that's taken over our public, imagination. Strange New World, also by Carl Trueman, is a condensation of the rise and triumph of the modern self. The Book That Made Your World by Vishal Mangalwadi on the Bible. Why Do You Think the Way You Do? Glenn Sunshine. Understanding the Times, a survey of competing worldviews by Myers and Noble. How Christianity Changed the World by Alvin Schmidt. The Air We Breathe by Glenn Scrivener. So there's some great resources for understanding ourselves better. And I'm going to stop there and just check the time. I think we've got time for a final few more questions before we hand over to Mark. Any more questions? Yes.
I just wondered if you could give us your perspective about the Mahdi timing and the Antichrist ideologies, and also on the money that's going towards bringing our parliamentarians, and then is it like a bribe so that they then can't talk about?
I don't know anything about the money going to politicians, so I'm the wrong person to ask. About the Mahdi and the end times, so there's this figure known as the Mahdi, which is believed will come back at the end of time and lead the Islamic battle to victory. And Jesus will return at that time to destroy the cross, the Islamic tradition says. But I must admit, I haven't studied those end time scenarios in detail. There's a Sunni version and a Shiite version. The Shiite, I think, believe that the Mahdi is the hidden imam who's been hidden and he's going to come back and suddenly appear in time. The Iranian leaders are very sold on this eschatology, this end times belief, which drives them. And they believe chaos will usher in the end. So they seem to be welcoming chaos, which is puzzling to Trump. So yeah, I haven't studied that enough to give more information about that. Yeah. Sorry? I think it's the same. There's a Mahdi that will come back and there'll be a cataclysmic end-time battle. Some have said the false Jewish Messiah will be killed by the true Islamic Jewish Messiah, Jesus. So, there's a Jalal, there's an Antichrist figure which is identified by some Muslims as Jewish. And Jesus will kill the false Jewish Messiah. Yeah. Over here, yep. That's a big topic. Like, what happens to people who become? What happens to people who give their lives to Jesus? Is that the question?
Yes, you said Muslims been involved with that.
Oh yes, okay. Well, the thing about the Iranians is most of them already don't like Islam. So some of them, when they become Christians and they tell their family, the family are upset, but others say, oh, good on you, you made your own choice. So Iran is kind of different because there's so much resistance to Islam in Iran. But in other cultural groups, you could certainly be excluded from family, you could lose your job, you could be killed. In Islamic law, killing an apostate is not a crime. So there's a great reluctance to prosecute people who use violence against people who've left Islam. You could also, technically, you lose all legal, you become a legal non-person if you leave Islam. So you can't mount a legal challenge, you can't give testimony, you lose the capacity to, your marriage is annulled, you lose custody of your children. So it can be very devastating. What believers who've left Islam need is a healing community. They need a new ummah, a family to be part of. So that's a big priority in places where people are coming to Christ. But they are turning to Jesus despite all those difficulties. And in fact, many missionaries would encourage Muslims to stay in their families if possible, to stay in connection with them, so they can share the gospel. And often after the first shock of rejection and anger, family members can come around and be restored. Not always, but they can be restored in their relationship. So it's a complicated and important issue. Just here, yes? Such a big question, like what can you do about Lakemba Mosque or Islam. I think you have to challenge certain teachings. It's good that people get prosecuted for spreading hate. One of the problems is that the challenge is so multifaceted. You know, you've got Islamization working on many different fronts at once. There might be a Muslim working for the member of parliament whose job it is to look after that issue. You know, so it's not just, oh, here's this pocket of bad people, what we can do about it. It's a whole systemic challenge. How do we see Islam? And it needs multiple points of action in many different ways. There's the educational challenge, what's happening in the schools, the school curriculum. There's the political challenge. There's relationships between different religions and how they're working. Like in the case of Lakemba, you really need the people of Lakemba suburb to say we don't want the call to prayer. But that will depend on who's on the council and who's been elected to the council. So I just encourage Christians to get involved and serve their local community by being elected and by speaking out. And yeah, that's what we need, more and more people like that. Is Pauline Hanson the answer? I'm going to pass on that one. A lot of people are turning to Pauline because the Liberal and the Labor Party, both of them, don't have a coherent response to some key challenges we're facing. Partly because of all these worldview problems, you know, that our worldview is crumbling. It's not really working anymore. So people have lost a compass and a direction. But Pauline, she's always been on one track, you know, so you know what she stands for, which is not so much the case today. So I'm not going to go into assessing Pauline's suitability to lead Australia. I'll leave that for others.